for putting this training together and for helping us with any tech issues that may present themselves. And so my name is Osvaldo Lopez. I work with Texas RioGrande Legal Aid. I've been here for about 10 years. And Texas RioGrande Legal Aid is, if you're not familiar with the organization, it was founded in 1970 to represent farm workers. It's grown into the nation's second largest legal aid provider and the largest in Texas. TRALA provides free legal services in South Texas, but also represents migrant and seasonal farm workers throughout the entire state and 6 southern states. And those states are Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. So some of my fellow co-workers are going to be presenting as well. Paula Garza, she's from Detroit, Michigan. I think she was born and raised there, and that's where she began her legal career. She's now in the Valley, and she's been working with TRALA for about 15 years now, helping clients with employment and workers' compensation claims. Jose Torres is a native of West Laco, Texas. He's been advocating for the rights of farm workers for the last 44 years, both as a community organizer with Texas Farm Workers Union and as a paralegal with Texas RioGrande Legal Aid. Mirna Ibarra, unfortunately, she had a family emergency and she's not going to be able to make the training, but she helps TRALA run the wills clinics, and that's where we help members prepare documentation that they need to execute their wishes whenever they pass away. And we have also Jose Joe Caraveo. He has helped clients with issues involving employment violations and also wrongful denial of the public benefits. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the learning objectives. One of the objectives that we hope to accomplish with this training is to identify and distinguish between the several types of farm workers. So we have migrant, seasonal, and H2A, and to gain knowledge of the needs of every kind of farm worker to develop a targeted and effective outreach plan. We also want to connect the lessons we learn throughout this training with the challenges that you all face conducting outreach to farm workers in your capacities in your organizations. And we're also going to have some breakout rooms. This training is going to be a bit informal. We want it to be interactive. We also want to learn from you guys because we have experience, but most of our experience is in Texas, and I know that things vary throughout the country. So we really look forward to learning from you guys as well. And I'm going to pass it over to Paula Garza, who's going to talk a little bit about what is outreach and why it's important.
Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is outreach and why it's important. Outreach is an act of connecting difficult to reach populations with social services, aka also our farm workers, including those offered by legal aid, healthcare, and other providers. Some populations may be difficult to reach because they're very isolated and physically removed from areas normally covered by service providers, while others don't have the resources like access to the internet and increasingly digital world to learn about and apply for services online. Some populations experience, among other things, language barriers, especially if they're recently immigrated to the US from non-native English-speaking countries. Farm workers in particular face a combination of these challenges when accessing social services available to them. They normally work and live in isolated and remote areas, often lack access to the internet. They experience language barriers. Most farmers, well, they experience most language barriers, sorry. Most farm workers have very limited English language skills and as well are limited in their education. And for those reasons and other reasons, outreach is a crucial part of servicing farm workers. Making healthcare services accessible to farm workers, for instance, can be the difference between them receiving preferred preventative and critical medical care. The impact a provider can have on their lives as farm workers can be very significant. And lastly, also another reason why outreach is vital is because most farm workers don't know that they have rights, even when they are not in their homeland or state.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks, Paula. Yeah, so it's really important that farm workers know about their rights, because to be able to exercise them, they first have to become familiar with them. But not only do they have to know about their rights, they also have to know that there are resources out there for them to consult with, and that way farmers can address any issues that they may face throughout their employment. So just to briefly touch on the types of farm workers, we have migrant farm workers, seasonal farm workers, and H-2A farm workers. Migrants, by definition, are those that engage in agricultural work of a seasonal or temporary nature, but are required to be absent overnight from their permanent place of residence. So this means that some of the characteristics that are unique about migrant farm workers is that they have to be absent overnight from their permanent place of residence because they travel hundreds of miles to engage in agricultural work. They are usually recruited by farm labor contractors who are hired by growers so that they can begin recruiting farm workers. And part of the recruitment process, they offer housing since they have to travel very long distances, and farm work is naturally seasonal. So workers are trying to maximize their earnings. And so saving on housing expenses is a good incentive for them. And these housing camps where the migrant farm workers live, they can be structures of any kind as long as they satisfy the housing regulations. But it is common, for example, in the Texas Panhandle and also throughout the Midwest, for employers to use motels as housing. And this is going to vary from state to state, but some of the housing camps may be registered with the state. It just depends how aggressive the organization in each state is with inspections, but they should have a record of the migrant farm worker housing that you may be able to access and use as a guide whenever you're planning your outreach. And so then we have seasonal farm workers. These are workers that are not required to be absent overnight, which means that employers who hire seasonal workers are not inclined to provide housing. This means that the seasonal workers live in their own individual permanent places of residence, and that would make it a little bit more difficult for social providers to reach them. Because as opposed to migrant farm workers, you don't have a large concentration of seasonal workers living in an area. You could have a large concentration of seasonal workers living in a colonia, for example, but that's something that you're gonna have to figure out. Which colonia is heavily populated by farm workers? And there are different ways to do that because seasonal workers, since they do not stay in housing camps, you can't really find information on where they live. So you have to approach this outreach to seasonal farm workers a bit differently than you would migrant farm workers. And one of the strategies that we often use is we visit local establishments like laundromats, convenience stores, and Walmart, because everyone throughout the entire world is familiar with Walmart, including farm workers. And we drop off flyers there. Workers may come across the material and then they could reach out if they have any questions or concerns. And then we have H-2A farm workers. The guest worker program allows employers in the US to bring in non-immigrant foreign farm workers to fill employment vacancies in agriculture whenever employers can prove there is a shortage of domestic workers. And there are some unique characteristics about H-2A workers. For example, they can only be here for a maximum of 10 months, and then they have to go back to their home country. And they can only work for that specific employer that petitions them. So I don't know, if they get treated badly, they don't have the option of just quitting and going to work with some other employer. And so employers could bring in H-2A workers. They need to submit an application and a clearance order to the U.S. Department of Labor. The clearance orders, they usually contain, or they must contain the terms and conditions of employment. The clearance orders must state things like the name and location of the employer, the start and end dates of employment, the number of workers requested, the anticipated hours of employment, and fortunately for us outreach staff, the location of the housing that employers are required to provide to H-2A workers. You can access these clearance orders online using the Department of Labor's website. And that's how the DOL's website looks like this. So you would have to type into the browser search bar seasonaljobs.dol.gov, and this website is going to pop up, and you can use the search bar to search for things like by occupation, job title, industry, employer name, in case there's a specific employer that you're trying to target. And you could also search by location using city, state, or zip code. Once you conduct the search and you find some clearance orders that you would like to target, they're going to look something like this. And I've highlighted the information that's important on these work orders. I mean, all the information on them are important, but for purposes of outreach, for example, you get to find out how many workers the employer petitioned. And in this case, the employer petitioned 200 petitioned and was certified for 285 workers. This is an employer that is based in the Texas Panhandle. It's KB Custom Ag Services LLC. And the anticipated days and number and hours of work per week is 57, an average of 9.5 a day. You see down at the bottom, the wage offer, which is $16.47. And it just depends on in which state the workers work. The employers cannot pay anything less than the adverse effect wage rate. In Texas, I believe right now it's around $13.88 an hour. And over here on the right, I have another image with more information. It lists the address, the place of employment, and it also lists the housing information. So the housing information, it's what's going to come in very handy for us. This is where we're going to find the workers. This is where the workers are supposed to be housed, assuming that the information on these clearance orders is correct, because many times it's incorrect and it's difficult to actually find the housing location. You have to ask for directions or just ask people in the area if they've ever come across H-2A workers and where it is that they live. You can also use TRALA's data scraper tool. We're going to send the links in the chat. That way you guys can check it out. It's a really useful tool. It has some information about where the data comes from, what kind of information you can get from that data. But it's basically like another tool that you can use to search for H-2A and H-2B job posting data. Just play around with it. It's a really neat tool. I think it's a little bit more efficient than the Department of Labor's website, but both are very helpful. Okay, so we're gonna break out into sessions, breakout rooms, and we're gonna talk about what type of farm workers you guys encounter in your service area and which farm workers are the most challenging to reach and why.
Okay, so we're going to give Sylvia a minute to get us all into our breakout rooms. A window is going to pop up and it's going to ask you to join a breakout room. So go ahead and select yes so that you could be moved to your specific breakout room.
Okay, cool. So that was a nice little session in our group. A lot of interesting things were shared. People experience different challenges depending on the area in which they provide services. And so it was a nice little conversation. I don't know if you want to give a few minutes for people to share. Maybe one or two people can share something that they discussed in the room.
I can go ahead and share mine. So one thing that I mentioned was that a lot of the farm workers that we receive in our organization are very almost like shy. they don't like to ask for help, and they don't like to mention when they don't understand something. And I'm so sorry. And a lot of them, when they get here, they have high blood pressure, high glucose, high cholesterol. And sometimes we do home visits with them. And when we get there, we realize that they haven't been taking their medication correctly because they didn't understand how to, and they didn't want to ask for help. So that is definitely one obstacle that we have.
Okay, that's interesting. And that's in which state?
This is in North Carolina.
Oh, okay, cool. Cool.
I'm gonna share. I was in group 6. This is Liliana from Campesinos Sin Frontera. We're talking about that the most difficult group to reach sometimes is the H2A workers, and that's because sometimes they're like we're like providers are not allowed to visit the places where they're staying, and we have to reach them in other areas such as swap meets, grocery stores. And Ivette was mentioning as well that it is important to build trust in order for providers to be able to talk to them sometimes or to ask some type of questions.
Yeah, that's the case with many, especially the H2A workers, because they don't have any connections to the community. They're in unfamiliar settings. And so sometimes it just takes it takes a few times actually to talk to them and get them to open up. But eventually I think they'll learn that you don't pose a threat to them and they may open up a bit more. But yeah, for now, it's a good idea to target them using other methods like going to the grocery stores and convenience stores, especially those stores that allow people to transfer money because they usually send back most of their earnings back home to their families.
I'd just like to mention real quick, last year in Colorado, we got a law approved that explicitly gives service providers the right to access farm workers in their housing. So when they're not doing payable work, which means that we can go on to the employer's property where the H2A workers are living, and we can go to the housing, and legally they cannot interfere with us. But just a couple of days ago, it got announced that a bunch of growers are putting together a lawsuit to get that overthrown, based specifically on the service provider access to their property. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, it gets kind of tricky there, right? Because farm workers, I mean, they're also tenants and they have the right to have visitors over, but I guess it just depends on each state's interpretations of those regulations. But that's a really good point. Yep. Because we did hear in our breakout room that people face those challenges. They have trouble accessing housing camps and therefore they cannot speak to the workers. Okay, great.
The H2 job orders specifically state that the H2 workers are entitled to receive social workers, okay? So, I mean, that's, another, angle that, people should take is that these workers are entitled to receive social workers who are going to give them information as to, basically, medical, and, at this point, in my opinion, legal, in regards to their rights. But of course, yes, the employer will threaten that particular or those particular social workers, and I've had, and I don't want to, like make it a big deal, but I've had employers basically that employees to workers that have pulled a gun on me, because they don't like the fact that their workers are being educated as to their rights because their employer is basically abusive towards them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yes, Jose has over 40 years of experience. So he's experienced it all, including having a gun pulled out on him. But I don't know, it doesn't, people should just be, take precautions, but also try and get this done intelligently and find creative ways of conducting effective outreach. Okay, cool. So then we're gonna move on to the next section, and Jose is gonna talk a bit about the Migrant Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act. And this is the act that provides protections to migrant and seasonal workers, and it sets the standards with respect to wages, housing, transportation, disclosures, and record keeping.
Yes, buenas tardes. Yeah, the Agricultural Worker Protection Act, was passed in 1985. Before it was FLICRA, the Farm Labor Contractor Registration Act, which basically was pro, contratista, the farm labor contractor. The APA, as we call it, is a little bit more, progressive in regards to the workers' right. But we have a big phenomenon in regards to farm workers in this country. In 1935, there was an act that was passed, which is called the National Labor Relations Act, that gave the workers up in the Midwest area who were industrial workers, etc., the right to organize, to sit down and bargain, for their, salary, working conditions, etc. Now, farm workers were excluded. One is because of the fact that the majority of the farm workers at that particular time were African American workers that were in the South. So therefore they didn't want, the African American workers to have the right to organize because of the fact that they were previously slaves. So, this Southern white, farmers, growers, etc., they said that is not going to happen. So that was like a concession that the Roosevelt administration did with the Southern politicians. So since then, farm workers have not had that right to collective bargaining. The other farm workers that were affected also was the farm workers in the West, which was the Filipinos, the Mexicanos, the Japoneses, etc. And of course, a lot of the white, poor farm workers that had, left the, different areas because of the fact that, the conditions that were going on throughout the country. But anyway, so since then, farm workers, except for, for example, California, who, was able to have a state agricultural labor relations act for farm workers, and of course, a few other states. Other than that, the farm workers have been forgotten, and that's about, an average about maybe 75 years up to this point, and still farm workers on a national level are not allowed to collectively bargain for their working conditions, especially their salaries. So the Agricultural, Labor Protection Act was passed, and that is what makes, the contractor, the employer, that he must give the worker, in writing as to what are going to be the conditions of employment, and it's going to be where, what kind of crop, the rate of pay, will there be any bonuses? Will there be overtime? But of course, farm workers in the field do not get overtime unless it's written. How many hours they're gonna work per day, weeks, months, the length of employment, how long is it gonna last? Basically also is that the farm labor contractor has to show you that he has the authority under the Department of Labor to be able to recruit, farm workers and to transport them and to house them. Farm workers, of course, are, they need to be given, written receipts. Every one of each family member has to get a receipt. Not only the head of the household is usually done. So every child needs to get a receipt. The wife also, which a lot of times causes consequences in regards to the benefits that you get once you become disabled or you retire, in regards to how much money you have in your Social Security. Then also the employer has to give you information in regards to the housing again and the transportation. Is it going to be free? Is there going to be a fee charge? and what have you. The vehicle that you're going to be transported, that the farm worker is going to be transported, has to have insurance, and the driver has to be, given a test that he's in good health and not an alcoholic or get seizures, and is not supposed to be driving a vehicle. So and then of course housing has to pass inspection by a state agency. Here in Texas, it's hardly done. So I don't know about the other different states. So again, the transportation from the housing to the workplace, basically it should be free. Any tools that they give you, they should be free, and of course you return them back to them. So when workers, for example, finish their rows, like for example in the detasseling, and they're sitting in the bus waiting for the other workers to finish, that is basically hours that they should pay you for that time. And of course, when you're out in the field, they should be given clean and fresh water, which is accessible to you. It cannot be like a mile, 2.5 miles away. It's got to be, 1/4 of a mile from where you're working. And the contratista should be moving that water, to get closer to the workers. And of course, he should provide bathrooms for the female workers and for the male workers, and they should have toilet paper, towels, soap, and water so you can wash your hands. And of course they cannot be no more than 1/4 of a mile from where you're working, and they should be constantly moved. And the contratista should not force you to buy food or drinks from him. And of course, there should be no drugs in the workplace. And if the farm worker is going to handle some kind of chemicals, he or she has to be trained properly to be able to handle those chemicals. And of course, they should not discriminate or threaten, based on your color, sex, national origin, age, religion. And of course, the women in particular should not be, sexually harassed, as in many occasions, that's what happens. Of course, when you're out in the field, you should not earn no less than $7.25 an hour. But of course, if you're in a particular state that pays more than $7.25 per hour, then they should pay you what that state wages are. And children under 14 years of age should not be out in the field. They should be somewhere in one of those daycares, etc., school that a lot of you folks work with. So the last thing is that you should document everything in regards to what you're told, because even though you're not given a written disclosure, which is required under the APA, you should, if they give you by mouth only, by word, you should document what they tell you, because that is also, a binding agreement. Packing shed workers are entitled to time and a half, only and if that product is being brought in from other farms, or from, for example, Mexico. And of course, the majority of the time, the services that all of us provide, they're free. So, you should be able to stress that the most, so that people will not feel that when they're giving you information that at the end is going to cost them, like in many other places. That's about it, about what I have, and make sure you document things. That's the most important thing, that you relate to your clientele, that they should document as much information. And the other thing is that, take down the license plates of the employer as soon as you can, in case, for example, you don't have a way to get their addresses, etc. But with their license plates, they can be traced. If anybody has questions, fine, and if not, thank you. And of course, excuse me for being a little bit too, not clear, perhaps.
Muchas gracias, José. And so, yeah, so some of the practical tips that we provide to workers are that, one, that they should keep a record of everything, keep every document that they sign, make sure not to sign anything that they don't understand. But also with respect to oral promises, they do form part of the contract, except that it's just very difficult to prove that those promises were made when they're not in writing. So that's why we also recommend that workers speak with their employers with someone else present so that they serve as a witness to the conversation and the details that were shared. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and break out into another room. And basically, based on what Jose said, we're gonna talk about the issues that we encounter in our industry and service area. So for example, if you interact a lot with migrant workers, then some of the complaints that you will hear about will usually have to deal with the housing regulations. Maybe some of the workers don't have a mattress, things like that. But if you work with a lot with H2A workers, one of the complaints that you'll likely hear is that they haven't been reimbursed their travel expenses or inbound travel expenses. So it just depends the type of farm workers that we interact with and the service area in which we operate. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and break out into those rooms and discuss that for a bit.
To local communities. They may hesitate to engage in dialogue with people, service providers they haven't met or they just met. It usually helps to open dialogue with conversations that doesn't immediately address the employment-related concerns. Also, a worker is likely to be more receptive and respond to a question about where they're originally from than one that involves their pay rate, for instance. Once the workers warm up to you, it's okay to begin inquiring about their experience working for their employer, and if there's any, and they'll open up more once they feel more comfortable. Okay. Talk about their concerns and appreciate that they have different form. They may be different from your perceived notions. Okay, don't tell them that what their concerns are, since you may not know them, and do not try to convince them that they're victims of exploitation. Okay, the reason that for outreach staff try very hard to connect with farm workers is not to convene them to act or feel a certain way, but certain way about themselves or their relationship with their employer. Effective outreach is merely making information and services accessible to those who otherwise wouldn't know about them. Identify yourself and tell them your organization services are free early in the conversation, and assure them you are not there to sign them up for paid services. And don't talk about lawyers and their rights from the start. They often have a negative impression of what a lawyer does or wants. TRLA's outreach staff believes it is helpful to advise the workers soon after making contact that the services of the organization's offers are free. This lets the workers know that there are no ulterior motive behavior for the staff's visit. Immediately talk about workers' rights and the legal remedies available to them. Might cause workers to feel uneasy. This perception of legal system in the U.S. could be influenced by adverse experiences with the legal system back home, for instance. Do ask a lot of questions that lead to more substantive conversations, and don't question them like if you're their parents. Workers are grown adults and not children. Workers may not respond to direct questions like, how much do you make an hour? They just met you and could be unsure whether they trust you or not. Okay, you can try asking questions like, how many hours do you normally work in a day, and how much do you normally make a week? This will let you calculate their hourly rates, assuming the responses were accurate. Also, always respect the autonomy of the workers as adults. They do not have to receive any visitations. Do remember as much as you can, but take notes as soon as you can after the visit, and don't walk into a room a room or a camp with a notebook in hand, and this also applies into the fields. Workers may be aware of your visit, especially if they see you making notes of what you're saying. They don't assume that these notes are going to be kept confidential, even though law firms like TRLA own that duty even to prospective clients. To avoid making a challenging task more difficult, it's recommended to approach workers without a notebook in hand. And do conduct outreach in pairs. Don't conduct outreach by yourself if you could avoid it. If available, don't conduct outreach by yourself for safety reasons. You should try to conduct outreach with a pair, in addition to letting somebody that isn't part of the outreach group know your location. Okay. Talk to local allies and advocacy groups before your trip to gather knowledge on workers' whereabouts. And don't conduct outreach without a plan. Farm workers and laborers, but farm workers are laborers, but they're also patients, patrons to local businesses and churchgoers. Talking to more established organizations could help narrow the area you should target to maximize outreach resources. Do park nearby farm workers' housing, but not in a place where your vehicle is in the spotlight, and don't try to hide. You want farm workers to know you are not afraid to be there. It isn't uncommon for farm labor contractors to stay in the same housing that they or the grower provide workers. They're recruited. This can cause workers to feel uneasy on sharing information about their working conditions while interacting with them at housing camps. You may want to remain somewhat inconspicuous when visiting workers to avoid attracting the attention of their employer. There we go. We're in the right place. A housing camp sees slightly interested in talking further. Plan to meet elsewhere if it is feasible to have a private conversation with them, and don't divulge information that should remain confidential. Workers may not feel comfortable discussing this particular situation in front of other workers because other workers may be supposed to or preferred by their employers. Ensure that you have ample supplies of business cards with your direct extension so that workers can reach out to you after your departure. Don't compel workers to share information in front of others. You should speak privately whenever workers want to share information in details about any problems they might be facing. And do also at all times be honest. If you don't know the answer to one of their questions, tell them you'll get back to them. Don't make promises. Don't make promises or share information you may not be certain is true. Fill up your message before visiting. If you know whom you're visiting, don't use complicated legal jargon to explain their rights. People talk, not lawyer talk. Before you talk to farm workers in the US on an H-2A visa, download and review the job clearance order. You can use information on the order to develop the message. Your message shouldn't use complicated legal jargon or terms like adverse effect, wage rate, which are established nationally by the OFLC administrator. Do establish the goal of your trip. This should vary depending on whether you've been to a location, and don't leave a trip without leaving some sort of plan in the office for someone else to know your whereabouts. Sometimes the purpose of the outreach is simply to make contact with any worker. Other times, though, it may be to reach workers employed by a specific employer to talk about their specific issues. It's important to establish the goal of your outreach trip so that you can plan accordingly. If you use employment terms workers might use, and you will learn this over time. Don't insult workers by trying to be like them. In the tacitly, for instance, there are terms like surco that workers use to determine their pay rate if they're paid by the acre. Becoming familiar with these terms will help with communication. And do wear normal clothes for outreach. Don't dress up formally. Workers may not be receptive to someone in a suit or in tie or heels. If someone is dressed very formally, workers may assume they work for a government agency that may cause them to shut down, especially if they believe that the information they share may be used for enforcement of regulations. As legal service providers, we always remind prospective and current clients that anything done on their behalf requires their consent. And that is very important. Everything that we do is for the workers with their permission. Do research the targeted crop during your planning so that you know what stage in the harvest of work the workers are in, how the crop is growing, harvested, planted, in terms of condition that may be specific to a crop. And never travel without your materials. You never know when you'll run into workers with issues outside of your original outreach plan. Researching the crop you are targeting will help with understanding which issues workers may be facing. This is our presentation. Thank you all for your time and for attending. If you have any questions, just let us know.